In 1984, a young pilot took off in his small plane for what should have been a quick, simple flight. The skies were clear. The route was routine. He promised his family he'd be home before dark. But he never came back. When the hours stretched into days, panic set in. Search teams filled the skis and forests. Volunteers combed rivers and hills. Hundreds looked, but not a single clue was found. No wreckage, no body, nothing. And for 13 long years, his family lived in silence and unanswered questions. Until one day, a group of hunters wandered deep into the woods. One of them spotted something strange sticking out of the roots of a tree. At first, it looked like trash, but it was. It was a watch that belonged to the missing pilot. And what came next would shake an entire town to its core. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. I'll be reading through them all. The sun had just begun to rise over the small town, casting a pale orange glow across the airfield. Inside his modest home, the pilot was already awake. He moved quietly, careful not to wake his spouse, though he didn't have to hide his excitement. Today was just another flight, routine, he told himself, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. He dressed quickly, checked his watch, and went over his flight plan. The route was simple, a short trip home. He traced the path with his finger on the paper map, mentally noting landmarks, rivers, and forested stretches. Everything seemed clear. He double-checked his instruments and prepped his small, single-engine plane. Fuel levels, controls, and radio all ready. He went over the checklist again, methodically, confidently. Years of experience made him precise. Downstairs, his spouse watched quietly, a mixture of pride and concern on her face. "Don't be gone too long," she said softly, trying to hide the worry in her voice. He smiled, ruffling her hair, and said, "I'll be back before lunch. You know me, everything's under control." She nodded, trying to believe him, trusting him as she always had. His parents were there too, standing by the window. They admired their son's skill and confidence. "Take it slow, okay?" his mother said. He waved her off with a chuckle, adjusting his jacket. "I've flown this route 100 times. I know it like the back of my hand." His father nodded, pride mixing with unease. There was a quiet understanding between them. He loved flying, and it was who he was. The pilot stepped outside into the cool morning air. The plane gleamed softly under the first rays of sunlight. He ran his hand along the fuselage, checked the wings one more time, and climbed into the cockpit. Engines purred as he ran through his final checks. Every movement was precise, practiced, natural. Calm filled him, but beneath it, a tension lingered, invisible, unnoticed. As he adjusted his headset, he looked back at his family. They waved, unaware this would be the last time they would see him like this. Everything seemed normal. Everything felt safe. And yet, in the stillness of that morning, something was about to change. The hangar was quiet except for the low hum of the engines. The pilot walked down the steps from the cockpit, adjusting his jacket one last time. His spouse rushed forward, wrapping him in a tight hug. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered, gripping his shoulders. "I always am," he replied, a smile tugging at his lips. He lifted her chin gently and kissed her forehead. "I'll be back before lunch. You'll barely notice I'm gone." She tried to believe him, but her eyes glistened with worry. His parents came forward as well, embracing him, exchanging quiet words of pride and love. "Take it slow, son. Watch the skis," his father said. The pilot nodded, giving a reassuring wink. He stepped back, hands on his hips, pretending to stretch. "All right, I've got to get going. You all take care." His mother held onto his arm for a moment longer, reluctant to let go. The camera lingers on their faces. Hope, fear, love, emotions tightly wound together. They do not know this is their last ordinary moment with him. He climbed into the cockpit, closing the canopy over himself. The engine roared to life. He checked his instruments, radios, and gauges once more. Every movement was deliberate, every action practiced. Confidence radiated from him, masking any small doubts. To him, this was just another flight, routine and safe. Before taxiing, he leaned out of the cockpit slightly. "Wave to me," he called, and his spouse laughed softly, waving her hand as best she could. His parents stood nearby, their faces pale in the morning light. For a moment, it seemed normal, the sun shining, birds calling, nothing out of place. Then he started down the runway, slowly at first. The camera follows as the plane gains speed, engines humming, wheels spinning. His eyes scan the horizon. Everything is calm, clear, and precise. The small plane lifts gracefully into the sky. The family watches, waving, smiling, unaware that the next time they see him will not be like this. As the plane disappears into the blue morning, a subtle unease creeps in. The town seems quiet, almost too quiet. The pilot's last words, his last smiles, his last hugs, all ordinary moments are frozen in time. The ordinary has ended. Something unseen is about to change everything. The engines rumbled, a low, steady vibration that filled the hangar and the morning air. The pilot's hands were firm on the controls, moving smoothly as if in a rhythm he had known all his life. He pushed the throttle forward and the small plane lurched down the runway. Wheels sped over asphalt, humming, leaving tiny clouds of dust behind. His family's eyes followed him. His spouse clutched her jacket tightly, squinting against the sun. His parents stood frozen, hope and worry battling across their faces. They saw the plane pick up speed, the nose lifting slightly, and then the small aircraft began to rise, cutting through the morning sky with confidence. The wind whipped past the cockpit and the pilot felt the familiar thrill of flight. The world below shrank, rooftops, fields, and roads sliding away under the plane's wings. He glanced briefly at his instruments. Everything green, everything normal. Freedom stretched out ahead of him, endless and clear. But even in this calm, a tension lingered in the air, invisible, intangible. The quiet hum of the engines mixed with the birdsong below. His family waved, the figures on the ground growing smaller and smaller. They were already distant, though the pilot did not know it. As the plane soared higher, the horizon seemed to stretch forever. Clouds drifted lazily, sunlight sparkling across fields and rivers. The pilot tilted the plane slightly, adjusting for wind. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, precise. This was a routine flight, ordinary, safe, expected. And yet the ordinary felt fragile. The plane disappeared slowly into the distance, becoming a tiny speck against the blue sky. Behind him, the world continued, unaware of what was about to unfold. His family's smiles froze, replaced by a subtle unease they could not name. The morning seemed too quiet, the air too still. Back at air traffic control, a calm voice crackled over the radio. "Flight 7C, do you read? Report your altitude and position." The pilot's voice answered, steady and professional. "Reading you loud and clear. Altitude 3,000 feet, heading northeast." Everything seemed routine. The controllers typed notes, eyes scanning monitors, fingers on keyboards. The pilot continued speaking, reporting speed, wind, and position at regular intervals. The voice was calm, practiced. There was nothing unusual, nothing alarming. The small plane moved smoothly across the sky. From the cockpit, the pilot scanned the horizon. Clouds drifted past, the landscape below shifting subtly. Forests, fields, rivers cutting through the terrain. Everything looked normal. He adjusted the controls slightly, maintaining steady altitude, maintaining rhythm. Then silence. No crackle of radio, no static, no signal. Just quiet. Controllers tried again, calling for a response. "Flight 7C, do you copy?" The words echoed in the empty air. A bead of worry formed on the foreheads of the controllers. The family, watching the skis from the hangar, didn't hear the silence yet, only the fading roar of engines. But in the control tower, the first uneasy feeling began to settle. Something was off. Nothing had prepared anyone for what was about to happen. Minutes passed. The voice did not return. The instruments on the radar showed the plane moving, then a small blip barely noticeable. And then nothing. No movement, no signals, just the empty expanse of sky. The calm professionalism of the pilot's voice, the routine reports, the ordinary takeoff, it all ended. Quiet filled the air. Subtle tension crept in, almost unnoticed at first. Something was wrong. Something invisible, something beyond explanation had begun. The pilot, confident, skilled, and experienced, was gone from contact. The ordinary morning had turned strange, and the quiet unease began to spread, touching the hearts of everyone who had watched him take off. Hours passed and the pilot still hadn't arrived. His spouse stood at the window, staring at the empty horizon. The phone had rung a dozen times, each unanswered call adding to the growing panic. She tried to calm herself, repeating that it was just a routine flight, but the minutes stretched into hours and a gnawing fear began to take hold. She paced the living room, wringing her hands, checking the clock over and over. Each tick sounded louder than the last, a reminder that something was wrong. Outside, the sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to echo her unease. His parents called friends and relatives, their voices tight with worry. "Have you heard anything? Seen anything?" they asked, but every answer was the same. No, nothing. The town seemed to have swallowed the pilot whole. Neighbors began to notice the family's concern. Quiet whispers filled the air. Did something happen? Could it be an accident? The uncertainty was unbearable. Every possibility, no matter how unlikely, raced through their minds. They imagined him stranded, injured, or worse. The tension in the house became almost tangible. The living room, once filled with laughter and conversation, was now heavy with fear and silence. Every sound outside made the spouse jump, imagining the plane or its pilot coming home in some unexpected way. Even as they tried to hold on to hope, the dread grew. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The ordinary morning had ended, replaced by fear, confusion, and a creeping realization that something had gone terribly wrong. By late afternoon, authorities were notified. Local police, fire departments, and volunteers gathered quickly, assembling a coordinated search. Planes were prepared to scan the flight route, while teams on the ground formed lines to comb the forests and fields. Everyone moved with urgency, aware that time was critical. The sky above grew busier with small search aircraft, their engines roaring as they traced the pilot's expected path. On the ground, volunteers moved carefully through dense underbrush, calling his name, scanning for any sign of wreckage or movement. Dogs were brought in, sniffing the earth, alert to even the faintest trace. Despite the efforts, nothing was found. No twisted metal, no oil slick, no smoke rising from the trees. Every hour that passed without a clue increased the tension and frustration. Volunteers wiped sweat from their brows, shaking their heads, feeling the weight of the invisible search. Back at the family's home, the anxiety deepened. The spouse followed updates by phone, listening to reports with a mixture of hope and dread. Each passing hour made the unknown feel heavier, the silence of the forest more menacing. The parents tried to remain calm, but their faces betrayed the growing fear. Authorities discussed plans, reviewing maps and flight logs, trying to determine where to search next. Every possible area had been checked, every obvious route scanned. And yet, the pilot remained missing. The frustration was not only professional but deeply personal, as everyone involved began to feel the emotional weight of a disappearance that seemed impossible to explain. The forest, rivers, and hills swallowed their efforts. The community, once calm and familiar, now felt tense and uncertain. The missing pilot was not just an unknown location on a map. He was a loved one, a husband, a son, a friend. And the fact that no trace of him could be found made every passing moment more unbearable, every unanswered question sharper. The first search efforts, meant to reassure and locate, instead magnified the fear. The pilot had vanished, and the world was left grasping at shadows, trying to find something that wasn't there. Darkness settled over the airfield, and the familiar world of morning light and routine disappeared. The hangar loomed in shadows, empty and silent, as if holding its breath. The plane was gone from sight, and with it, the hope of an easy answer. Inside the house, the pilot's family huddled together. His spouse held tightly to a blanket, gripping hands, eyes brimming with tears. His parents sat close, voices low, whispering prayers and words of comfort that barely reached their own hearts. The hours had stretched unbearably long, and night made everything feel heavier. Flashlights swept across the hangar outside, cutting narrow beams through the darkness. Volunteers and search teams moved carefully, their eyes straining to see anything unusual. The engine's roar of the morning had been replaced by silence, the quiet so deep it seemed to echo the family's fear. The sky above was clear, stars twinkling faintly, indifferent to the worry below. Every shadow among the trees, every rustle of wind, became a potential clue. The forest seemed alive, swallowing the plane and its pilot without leaving a trace. Time felt slower in the night. Each minute stretched into eternity. The family whispered his name, calling into the darkness, hopping for a sound, a signal, a sign. But the forest returned only silence. An uneasy feeling settled in their chests. The ordinary had ended. Fear had replaced calm, and uncertainty had become unbearable. Every glance at the empty sky, every glance at the untouched hangar, reminded them that something had gone terribly wrong. Nightfall deepened the mystery. The small town, usually quiet and familiar, felt strange, tense, as if holding a secret it would not share. The pilot's absence became more than just a missing person. It became a shadow stretching over everyone who loved him. By the next morning, authorities officially declared the pilot missing. The words were simple, clinical, but their weight pressed down on everyone. He was not just late, not just delayed, he was gone. That label changed everything. Rumors began to spread quickly through the small town. Some said the plane had crashed somewhere deep in the forest. Others whispered that something more sinister had happened. Maybe he had been forced off course. Maybe someone had taken him. Fear mixed with speculation, and the ordinary morning of his flight was now an unsolved puzzle. Search teams expanded, checking new areas and revisiting old routes. Yet nothing turned up. Every cleared field, every riverbank, every stretch of forest yielded no answers. The absence of evidence only heightened the tension. How could an experienced pilot simply vanish? Neighbors and friends spoke in hushed voices, passing theories from one to another. Each new idea, each whispered possibility, added to the feeling that something was hidden, something beyond their understanding. The unknown grew larger than the visible world. The pilot's family struggled with the shock. Each phone call, each visitor, each glance out the window reminded them of the mystery that had appeared overnight. The photograph of the pilot on the wall, the untouched belongings in the house, the empty hangar outside, all became symbols of unanswered questions. Even the authorities admitted they were puzzled. Experienced search teams had failed to locate him. Radar scans, flight paths, and flight logs were examined and re-examined. Nothing explained the disappearance. The ordinary rules of flight, navigation, and safety had been broken in a way no one could explain. Suspense hung over the town. The pilot's routine flight had become a long, invisible nightmare. Every person who remembered him felt the weight of the unknown pressing in. The ordinary world had ended. The mystery had begun, one that would take years to unfold, one that would haunt everyone who cared for him. The airfield buzzed with activity. Police, fire personnel, and local volunteers crowded around tables covered with maps and flight logs. Radios crackled constantly, voices giving instructions, reporting updates, and coordinating teams. Helicopters were fueled and prepped. Small planes lined the runway, engines humming as pilots checked instruments. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Everyone moved quickly, aware that every minute counted. Volunteers carried flashlights, ropes, and first aid kits. Teams were divided, assigned specific areas to search. Officers marked coordinates on maps, plotting lines over forests, rivers, and hills. The pilot's expected route was traced repeatedly, but every detail only deepened the unease. Conversations were short, practical, focused. "Check the river bend first," one officer said. "We can't miss anything." Radios crackled back. "Copy that, teams moving out." Even with all this preparation, hope felt fragile. Everyone knew the clock was against them. The pilot's family hovered nearby, watching from a distance. Their faces were pale, eyes wide. Each passing second without news weighed heavier than the last. They listened to the constant hum of engines, the chatter of radios, the flurry of activity, and tried to believe that help would find him. But worry shadowed every movement, every plan. Even the volunteers, strangers to each other, shared the same unspoken fear. What if he wasn't out there at all? The thought hovered, but they pushed it aside, focusing on the task. Every map drawn, every line marked, every helicopter lifted was an attempt to push back the unknown. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the airfield. Yet despite all the preparation, a subtle tension lingered. Everyone felt it. This was no ordinary search. Something about the disappearance was unusual, unsettling. The pilot was skilled, careful, and experienced. He shouldn't be missing. And yet here they were, mobilized, ready to comb forests that seemed to stretch endlessly, searching for someone who had vanished without a trace. Planes lifted into the sky, engines roaring, slicing through clouds and wind. Pilots scanned the forests below, rivers cutting silver lines through the green, hills rising and falling like waves. Every inch of land along the pilot's route was examined, every clearing, every road, every river bend. The camera follows the empty route, tracking the path the pilot would have taken. The landscape passes quickly beneath, but nothing unusual appears. No glint of metal, no smoke, no sign that the small plane had touched the earth. Hours stretched into long, tense minutes. In the cockpit, pilots strained their eyes. Maps were sprawled out in front of them, coordinates marked, radio channels open. "Check that ridge again," one said. "We might have missed it." Another pilot scanned a river bend, shaking his head. Nothing here. Frustration began to creep in, barely contained by professionalism. The forest seemed endless, swallowing everything. Its trees were dense, shadows dark, and rivers wound like threads through the landscape. Even the hills, which might have offered a clear view from above, showed no clue. The missing plane could be anywhere or nowhere at all. Back on the ground, families and volunteers watched the skis. Every plane that passed overhead brought a flicker of hope, but also fear. The minutes without news felt heavier than the hours, and the forest below seemed to mock their efforts, hiding its secret beneath layers of green. Time became a measure of tension. Every call over the radio, every check of the altimeter, every scan of the forest increased the mix of fear and frustration. Something wasn't right. A skilled pilot didn't simply disappear. Yet the evidence, or lack of it, made everyone wonder. Had the plane crashed and been missed? Or was this disappearance more mysterious than anyone could imagine? The sun began to dip, and shadows lengthened over trees and rivers. Still, nothing appeared. The forest had swallowed its secret, and no one, neither pilots, search teams, nor family, could find a trace. The search, though massive and urgent, seemed to vanish into the same mystery that had swallowed the pilot. Volunteers fanned out across the forest, moving in tight lines. Each person called the pilot's name, their voices bouncing off trees and echoing through the silent woods. Every step was careful, every branch pushed aside, every hollow checked. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks twisting underfoot, slowing the search and testing patience. Dogs ran ahead, noses to the earth, sniffing every scent. They paused, barked, and darted to different paths, but found nothing. The animals seemed alert, aware of a trace, yet the forest swallowed it all, leaving only silence. Creeks were checked, rocks turned, and muddy banks scoured. Volunteers looked for pieces of metal, fabric, or anything unusual. Hands were scratched, clothing torn, and boots filled with mud, but nothing appeared. The forest, thick and relentless, seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Every tree and thicket was examined carefully. Volunteers climbed small rises, scanning for any glimmer of the plane. Sunlight broke through the canopy in occasional rays, but they only illuminated leaves and undergrowth. Hours passed. Energy and hope were tested, but the small plane remained invisible. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Birds flew away at sudden movements. Wind rustled leaves, but no signs of the pilot were found. It felt as if the forest had claimed him, hiding every trace. Frustration began to rise. Volunteers wiped sweat from their brows, exchanged worried looks, and redoubled their efforts. They called out repeatedly, hoping that sound alone might guide them. Still nothing. The silence pressed down on them, the forest unmoved by human urgency. Even the most experienced volunteers were unnerved. A pilot doesn't vanish without a trace. Something about the forest, the missing plane, the empty skis, it all felt wrong. Yet they pressed on, mile after mile, step after step, refusing to quit. Every tree, every creek, every root was examined, but the forest offered nothing. The mystery deepened with every passing hour. A crackle came over a volunteer's radio. "We've got something. Repeat, coordinates coming in." Hearts raced instantly. Volunteers dropped packs and sprinted toward the signal. Excitement surged, hope flickering like a small flame. Could this be the plane? Could this be him? Teams moved quickly, navigating through dense trees and tangled roots. Radios echoed with directions and updates. Every person felt tension tighten their chest. They pushed through undergrowth, calling his name, scanning for anything that might appear. Then they arrived at the source. Empty ground, nothing unusual. A broken branch, a rusted tin, a rock, but nothing belonging to the plane. Relief was replaced instantly by disappointment. Hope had surged only to crash down. Volunteers exchanged frustrated looks, heads shaking, hearts sinking. More false signals appeared over the radio throughout the day. Everyone sent teams scrambling, racing across muddy forest floors, hearts pounding with adrenaline. Each time it ended in disappointment. Nothing. Every hope was met with silence. Every lead turned into a dead end. The family heard of these efforts, clinging to each report as a possible sign. Every call, every hint, every sighting became a lifeline, a reason to hope. But when the reports came back empty, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. Faces fell, hands clutched tightly to each other, eyes searching the horizon, silently asking why. Even the authorities admitted frustration. Experienced searchers, used to emergencies and accidents, were baffled. The plane, the pilot, all seemed to vanish without leaving a trace. The forest remained silent, mocking their efforts. Yet despite the failures, the community refused to quit. Families, friends, and volunteers kept searching, driven by love, duty, and desperation. Every false lead was a punch to the stomach, yet they pressed on. The missing pilot was out there somewhere, they believed. Somewhere hidden, waiting to be found. The day ended with no answers. Shadows lengthened over the trees, and the forest held its secrets tightly. The search had begun with hope and urgency, but now tension and dread had taken root. The mystery deepened, stretching the hearts of everyone involved. Weeks passed, and the initial urgency began to fade. Search teams grew tired. Volunteers returned to their normal lives, exhausted from long days walking forests, scanning rivers, and flying over hills. Equipment wore down, helicopters needed maintenance, and fuel budgets ran thin. Authorities called a meeting. After long discussions, they announced they were reducing operations. "We've covered the area thoroughly," an official said. "We cannot continue indefinitely." The words were calm, professional, but heavy with finality. Some locals were frustrated. Parents, friends, and neighbors argued that more should be done. "You haven't even checked everywhere," one volunteer shouted. Others shook their heads, despair mixing with anger. The tension in town was palpable. The pilot was still missing. Families watched the announcement unfold on television or listened on the phone. The pilot's spouse felt a sharp pang of fear and disbelief. How could the search scale back when he was still out there? His parents sat in silence, hands folded tightly, staring at the floor, unable to speak. The official words felt like a closing door. Even experienced searchers admitted to feeling powerless. They had covered forests, rivers, and hills, checked every likely route, yet nothing had been found. The invisible nature of the pilot's disappearance made everyone uneasy. How could someone vanish so completely? Despite the scaling back, small teams continued their efforts privately. Volunteers still walked small sections, hopping for a clue, a scrap, any hint of the pilot's whereabouts. But as the official search ended, the public felt the first real crack in hope. Tension and fear hung over the town like a heavy cloud. The pilot's disappearance remained unresolved. Time passed. Days became weeks, and the missing man's absence began to feel permanent. The official reduction of the search didn't solve anything. It only deepened the unease. Questions lingered, unanswered, hanging over every household, every conversation, every glance toward the sky. Whispers began circulating through the small town. Neighbors spoke quietly in doorways. Friends exchanged stories in hushed tones. Each retelling added new speculation, new fears. No one had answers, only theories. Some people said he had crashed somewhere remote, and no one wanted to find him. Others wondered if someone had taken him deliberately, or if he had disappeared on purpose. Every possibility seemed plausible, because nothing about his disappearance made sense. The pilot's family tried to block out the rumors, but it was impossible. Friends and strangers alike approached with questions, theories, or half-heard stories. Each conversation reminded them of the unknown, the unanswered, the invisible tragedy that had begun weeks ago. Fear spread alongside speculation. Conversations in the grocery store, the post office, and at work often turned to the missing pilot. Everyone had an opinion, a story, a guess. Tension grew. The ordinary routine of life was shadowed by uncertainty, suspicion, and worry. Even those who wanted to stay calm could not. Every glance at the sky, every unreturned call, every empty hour seemed to confirm that something was very wrong. The town became quieter at night, quieter in the streets, as if everyone were holding their breath. Some whispered about foul play, others about accidents hidden in the dense forest. The lack of evidence made every rumor more believable. People wondered if the pilot had been forced off course or if someone had wanted him gone. No one could be sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at everyone. The mystery deepened. What had happened to him? Where was he? The answers seemed farther away than ever. The pilot's disappearance had begun as a sudden shock but now stretched into a quiet nightmare. Families, neighbors, and authorities alike were left with fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. Even after weeks of search, no one could solve the puzzle. The missing pilot had vanished into thin air, and the town was left with whispers, shadows, and growing dread. Every story, every rumor, only added to the weight of the mystery. Even after the official search was scaled back, the pilot's family refused to give up. They could not accept the silence, the absence, the unknown. Each day, they rose early, checking maps, retracing his route, and planning small searches of their own. The spouse carried a flashlight into the woods at dawn, moving carefully among trees and roots. Every creek, every trail, every hill was examined. Hours passed, but the forest returned nothing. Yet she pressed on, driven by hope and desperation. His parents followed on separate paths, scanning rivers and meadows, calling his name into the wind. Every echo brought a mix of sorrow and determination. Friends joined them, volunteers offering hands, eyes, and energy, but the pilot remained missing. Nights were the hardest. Sleepless hours were spent planning, packing, and imagining every possibility. They pored over maps, notes, and aerial photos. Each night, they whispered prayers, each one carrying their fear and love into the darkness. Emotion ran high. Tears were shed quietly in the woods, in cars, and at home. The grief was raw, but it mingled with determination. They refused to surrender to the unknown. Every day without him strengthened their resolve. They could not let hope die, no matter how invisible it seemed. Neighbors watched with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. Everyone in town understood the cost. The pilot's family had been forced into a long, invisible battle against time, nature, and silence. Yet they continued, step by step, mile by mile, refusing to yield. The forest remained relentless, offering nothing, but the family persisted. Every creek scanned, every hill climbed, every tree examined was a silent declaration. They would not stop until they knew. The pilot's absence was a wound, and they would not leave it open. They searched for answers, but mostly they searched for him. The local news covered the continuing search, broadcasting images of volunteers combing forests and flying over rivers. Headlines flashed across screens. Pilot still missing. Search efforts continued despite official cutbacks. The town watched, tense and anxious. Neighbors gathered at the airfield and hangars, their eyes scanning the skies. Conversations were quiet, filled with speculation, worry, and fear. Everyone wondered the same thing. Was the pilot alive? Could he have survived? Or was this the start of a long, invisible tragedy? Children were kept inside, the adults whispering in doorways. Shops, cafes, and streets felt different, heavier, as if the absence of one man could change the rhythm of the town. Every engine overhead, every sound in the distance, brought a flash of hope or fear. Families who had never met the pilot felt the tension. The missing man had become more than a person. He was a symbol of uncertainty and fear. People watched the skies, waited for news, and held their breath. Every passing hour deepened the unease. Volunteers and neighbors spoke in hushed tones. Theories circulated. Had the plane crashed into a hidden valley? Had someone taken him? Had he flown somewhere impossible? The unknown infected every conversation. No one had answers, only questions that grew heavier with each passing day. The airfield, once a place of ordinary morning routines, now felt like the center of a quiet nightmare. Empty hangars echoed with past departures. The absence of the pilot felt in every corner. People paused as planes flew overhead, eyes tracking every movement, searching for signs invisible to the untrained eye. Anxiety hung over the town like fog. The missing pilot's face appeared in windows, newspapers, and conversations. Every glance at the sky reminded people that the ordinary world had ended. The mystery had begun, and no one could shake it. The town waited. Friends, families, and strangers alike held their breath, each hour stretching endlessly. The pilot had vanished, and the questions were only beginning. The silence, the fear, the uncertainty, all created a suspenseful atmosphere that would linger for years, shaping the lives of everyone who cared about him. Days turned into weeks, and the pilot's family remained trapped in uncertainty. Every morning, they rose with the same hope that today would bring news, but every night ended in silence. The house felt empty, the air thick with tension and unanswered questions. They revisited the hangar, running their eyes over the spot where he had taken off. Maps were spread across tables at home, flight paths traced repeatedly, coordinates double-checked. Phones were called constantly, friends, fellow pilots, anyone who might have seen him. Each unanswered call, each failed lead, added to the invisible weight pressing on their shoulders. The spouse spent hours packing, checking radios, scanning the sky from windows, hopping for a familiar sound or sight. Parents sat quietly, reviewing every note, every message, searching for patterns that could explain his disappearance. Each day brought the same routine: wake, check, hope, wait. Even meals became quiet, hurried affairs. Conversation had been replaced by tension, silence, and worry. Every sound from outside, a passing car, a bird's call, a plane overhead, sparked a mix of hope and fear. Every tick of the clock reminded them that he was still missing, still out there somewhere. The town noticed their struggle. Neighbors offered help, checked in, shared rumors or possible sightings. But nothing brought clarity, nothing eased the tension. The world moved on outside, but inside their home, time was frozen. Every moment without news was a reminder that the pilot's fate was unknown. They clung to hope, the only thing keeping them moving. Even as exhaustion settled into their bodies and hearts, they searched for signs, any hint, anything that might lead them back to him. Weeks stretched into a blur, but the family refused to stop. Each day, each hour, each breath carried the same silent question: where was he? Then a lead came. A witness claimed to have seen a small plane crash in a distant valley. The family's hearts raced immediately. Volunteers were called, vehicles loaded, maps checked again. Hope surged as they drove toward the location, imagining him trapped or alive somewhere in the trees. They moved quickly, scanning the hills and riverbeds. Volunteers called out the pilot's name, flashlights cutting through undergrowth, hands brushing branches aside. Every sound of breaking twigs, every movement in the shadows made them tense. Could this finally be the answer? Hours passed. Creeks were checked, slopes climbed, valleys examined, but nothing was found. No wreckage, no metal, no sign of him. The witness's memory had been mistaken. Disappointment hit hard. Hearts sank, tears appeared on cheeks, hands clenched in frustration. Yet even as hope cracked, determination grew. Each false lead reminded them of how careful they had to be, how relentless the search must continue. They could not give in to despair, even when the world seemed to mock them. Every mile they walked, every tree they scanned, strengthened their commitment to find him. Back home, the family recounted the search, analyzing what went wrong. Volunteers offered support, reminding them to keep trying, to follow every lead, no matter how uncertain. The tension remained, but so did the drive. Hope was fragile, yet alive. False leads became part of their story, part of the endless struggle. Each disappointment was painful, but it also reminded them that the pilot's disappearance was still unresolved. They learned to brace for more heartbreak, knowing that persistence might be the only way to uncover the truth. Months passed, and the first anniversary of the pilot's disappearance arrived. The house felt heavier than ever. The family placed flowers at the airfield, arranging them carefully near the hangar where he had last been seen. Each flower carried grief, hope, and remembrance. Inside, the photo of the pilot remained on the wall. His face, smiling and confident, stared back at them. A folded jacket on a chair, an untouched cup on the table, small reminders of his absence, small signs of grief frozen in time. Every object spoke of waiting, of loss, and of love that refused to fade. They spoke softly, sharing memories, recounting his habits, his laughter, the ordinary routines of a life now paused. Tears were shed quietly, hands held tightly, eyes searching for comfort in each other. The anniversary magnified the emptiness. Outside, neighbors passed by the airfield, pausing to look at the flowers. The town remembered him too. Conversations whispered about the mystery, about time passing without answers. The anniversary wasn't just a marker of days gone by. It was a reminder that the pilot's absence continued to ripple through the community. Despite the sadness, the family's resolve remained. The anniversary strengthened their determination to keep searching, to keep hope alive, no matter how fragile. They refused to let the day pass as another day without action. The camera lingers on small gestures, a hand brushing a flower, a tear falling onto a photograph, a glance toward the sky. The absence is tangible, heavy, and unshakable. Yet beneath the grief, determination persists. They will not stop. They will not give up. The mystery continues, the unanswered questions stretching into every day that passes. The first year ends with no answers. Silence fills the hangar, the house, and the forest. Time has passed, but the pilot remains missing. His family is caught between grief and hope, suspended in a limbo that will shape the years to come. As the years passed, the town began to move on. Neighbors went about their lives, shops reopened, children grew up, and news cycles shifted to other stories. But the pilot's family remained trapped in the same invisible world, where time had stopped the day he vanished. Friends who had once called daily or brought meals slowly stopped checking in. Visits became less frequent, conversations shortened, and support, though well-meaning, faded. The absence of the pilot became invisible to others, though painfully present to the family. Isolation deepened. They attended events, went to town, but everywhere they went, their grief was noticed, questioned, or misunderstood. Whispered comments, quick glances, and small judgments created a subtle pressure. People didn't understand why they couldn't simply move on. The family's world became smaller. Days and nights were dominated by waiting and searching. They avoided crowded places and long outings because every reminder of normal life felt impossible without him. Their routines revolved around hope and memory, leaving them emotionally exhausted. Even local authorities, though sympathetic, had new cases and new priorities. Search efforts had long since ended officially. The absence of external focus made the family feel even more alone, suspended in a limbo with no answers. Every glance at the empty hangar, the untouched flight gear, or the photo on the wall reinforced the reality. Life had moved on around them, but for them, nothing had changed. The town's progress highlighted their stagnation, intensifying the emotional weight of the years spent waiting. Yet in this quiet isolation, the family's determination did not waver. They were alone, misunderstood and judged at times, but they refused to let go of hope or surrender to despair. Then a spark of hope appeared. A mysterious call reached the family. Someone claimed to have seen a small plane in a distant area, or perhaps a pilot matching their loved one's description. Hearts raced instantly. The family mobilized quickly, loading vehicles, gathering maps, and calling volunteers. Every second felt critical. Their hands shook, their eyes were wide, and adrenaline coursed through them. Could this finally be the breakthrough they had been waiting for? They drove miles, scanning hills, forests, and valleys. Volunteers called out the pilot's name, flashlights cutting through brush, radios buzzing with updates. Every rustle in the leaves or glint of metal made hearts leap. Hours passed. The excitement became tension. Each corner checked, every clearing searched, revealed nothing. The mysterious sighting had been mistaken. The plane was not there. The pilot was still missing. The crash of disappointment hit hard. Tears flowed, shoulders slumped, and silent frustration filled the air. Yet even in despair, the cycle of hope and determination persisted. Each false lead strengthened their resolve, but also left them emotionally drained. The family returned home, exhausted but still unwilling to give up. They had been through this many times before, but the sting of each dead end never lessened. Hope flared, then faded, leaving only a hollow ache. The audience feels this cycle too. The tension, the brief excitement, and the crushing disappointment. The emotional roller coaster mirrors the family's long ordeal, showing how persistent hope and repeated heartbreak can wear down even the strongest hearts. To cope, the family developed small rituals. Lights were left on at night, casting a warm glow over empty rooms, as if guiding him home. They visited the hangar regularly, checking the spot where he had last been, speaking softly to the air as if he could hear them. His belongings remained untouched. Jackets hung in closets, flight gear neatly arranged, and personal items carefully stored. These items became more than possessions. They were anchors to memory, proof that he had existed, and reminders of their ongoing search. The pilot's photograph became the silent centerpiece of their lives. It hung on the wall, eyes bright, confident, familiar. They looked at it every day, sometimes speaking to him, sometimes just sitting quietly, letting the image carry their grief, hope, and love. Small gestures filled their time. A cup left on the table, a flashlight ready by the door, a note in the calendar marking another day without him. Each ritual, though quiet and ordinary, held deep meaning. It was their way of surviving the invisible void his disappearance had left. Neighbors noticed. Some thought the rituals unusual, some sympathetic, some silently judgmental. The family paid little attention. The routines were not for outsiders, they were for the living memory of the pilot, a way to keep him present in a world that had largely moved on. Time became measured in rituals, in visits, in small acknowledgments of absence. The family's grief was a constant companion, but it was joined by a careful, persistent hope. Each ritual was a silent promise. He may be missing, but he is not forgotten. The quiet routines, repeated day after day, reinforced both the emptiness and the love. They had no answers, no closure, but they had each other, and they had ways to keep the pilot's memory alive. Their limbo continued, suspended between grief and hope, shaping every moment of their lives. Years passed, seasons changed, children grew, and neighbors moved on with their lives. The town shifted subtly, new faces appeared, and daily routines continued for everyone else. But for the pilot's family, time seemed frozen. Every day, every hour was dominated by his absence. The spouse woke each morning with the same questions. Had he survived? Where was he? Could he still return? Days blurred together in a mix of hope and sorrow. Friends and distant relatives offered occasional comfort, but most had stopped visiting or calling. The family's world had become small, centered entirely on the missing pilot. Every familiar place reminded them of what they had lost. The hangar remained untouched, the equipment in the same spot, the flight plan still pinned to a corkboard. Every memory became a marker of absence. The house echoed with silence, interrupted only by the careful routines they had built to cope. The emotional tension grew heavier with each passing year. Grief lingered like a shadow, following every step. Small triggers, a plane overhead, a phone call from a stranger, a news story about aviation accidents, sent waves of anxiety and longing through them. The family carried invisible scars, emotional wounds that never healed. Neighbors noticed their quiet isolation. Children of the town grew up, asking about the missing pilot less and less. Friends assumed life had to move forward, but the family's lives remained tethered to him. Every day without answers deepened the emotional burden, making hope both precious and painful. Time passed slowly, but the questions remained. Where had he gone? Why had no one seen him? Could the truth ever be found? The absence, the uncertainty, and the relentless waiting became a defining part of the family's existence. Even as the world changed around them, the family held on to fragments of hope. Every day was a struggle between despair and determination, a balance of longing and survival. Their lives were suspended in an invisible limbo, shaped by grief, love, and the weight of unanswered questions. A decade went by, 10 years of searching, hopping, and grieving. Still, no clue emerged. No wreckage, no sighting, no message, only silence. The pilot's disappearance remained a mystery, unresolved and haunting. The family lived in a constant state of limbo, hope and despair intertwined, each day a struggle to balance the two. Every phone call or tip sparked excitement, but disappointment followed. The cycle became a quiet torment, wearing down their hearts and minds. Friends had mostly moved on. They no longer called daily or offered support. The town carried on around them, life continuing as if the pilot had never existed. But the family could not escape the empty spaces left behind. Every room, every chair, every photograph reminded them of what was missing. Memories of the pilot were alive and present in everything they did. His laugh, his habits, his morning routines, these small fragments lingered, creating both comfort and pain. Every anniversary, every holiday, and every ordinary day highlighted the absence, reinforcing the emotional cost of not knowing. The unanswered questions were constant. Had he crashed somewhere unknown? Was he alive at some hidden location? Could the years have erased all traces? The lack of answers weighed heavily, pressing down on their hearts. The audience feels the tension too, the long stretch of waiting, the invisible burden, the endless questions. The mystery is no longer a sudden shock. It is a slow, relentless presence, shaping the family's lives year by year. Even after 10 years, hope remained, fragile but persistent. The family continued their routines, small rituals and searches. Their lives were shaped by absence, but their love for the pilot endured. The lingering mystery created a story without resolution, a truth withheld by time and circumstance. The family's grief, hope, and determination became intertwined with the unanswered question, where is he? The emotional cost of a missing loved one was clear, deep, and long-lasting. It was the fall of 1997, 13 years after the pilot vanished. A small group of hunters set out into the forest. They carried rifles, wore heavy boots, and followed narrow trails through tall trees. The air was cool, and the forest floor was covered with fallen leaves. The men joked lightly as they walked, teasing each other about who would spot game first. Their laughter carried through the trees, cutting through the quiet. Birds scattered overhead, their wings breaking the silence for a moment. To the hunters, this was just another ordinary trip. The forest they entered was remote, thick with undergrowth and difficult to cross. Every step required pushing branches aside or climbing over fallen logs. The men were focused on the hunt, scanning for movement, looking for tracks, and watching the ground for signs of animals. They had no idea they were about to find something far more shocking than deer or elk. Hidden deep beneath the roots and mud was a secret that had been waiting for over a decade. The hunters continued forward, their boots crunching on twigs. One man stopped to take a drink of water, another adjusted his gear. Everything felt normal, routine. They thought the biggest surprise of the day would be whether they caught anything. But the forest had other plans. As the hunters moved deeper into the woods, one of them slowed down. Something unusual caught his eye. At first, it looked small, almost nothing at all, just a strange glint sticking out from the base of a tree. The man crouched down, brushing aside fallen leaves. He saw tangled roots pushing out of the ground, twisting together like fingers. Stuck between them was an odd shape, darkened with age. At first glance, it looked like trash. Maybe a piece of metal left behind by campers, or some old broken tool. The hunter muttered to himself and leaned closer, pulling away more dirt with his hand. The object didn't move easily. It seemed trapped in the roots, as if the tree had grown around it over the years. That detail alone was strange. Most trash wouldn't sit untouched for so long. The hunter called out to his friends. They came over, curious, crowding around as he cleared more of the soil. The object had a band, circular and rigid. The men frowned. This wasn't a can or a broken knife. It was something different. The forest suddenly felt quieter. The hunter tugged harder, freeing the object from the roots. When it finally came loose, the men stared in stunned silence. In his hand was a watch. The metal face was weathered but still recognizable, the strap worn but intact. What froze them in place wasn't just the watch. Attached to the strap was something pale and jagged, a fragment of human bone. For a moment no one spoke. The forest, once full of light banter, felt heavy and sinister. The hunters stood motionless, their eyes wide, their breaths short. One dropped his gear without realizing. Another covered his mouth, unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't an old tool, and it wasn't trash. It was evidence of something human, something tragic. The man holding the watch almost dropped it, but his hands locked tight, shaking. The group exchanged looks, each of them understanding at the same time. They had found the remains of a person. Questions crashed through their minds. Who was it? How long had it been here? Why was it hidden so deep in the woods? They didn't know yet, but one detail was clear. This was no random discovery. This was something that would reopen a mystery thought long forgotten. The forest suddenly felt different, as though it had been keeping a secret for years. And now, with a single accidental pull, that secret had been forced into the open. The hunters stood frozen for several minutes, none of them sure what to do. Finally, one pulled out a radio. His voice shook as he tried to explain what they had found. Within an hour, the quiet forest was filled with the sound of engines. Police vehicles bounced along the dirt path, stopping near the hunters' location. Officers stepped out quickly, their expressions shifting as soon as they saw the object. The hunters tried to explain, but the police were already moving with urgency. Radios crackled. More officers arrived, some carrying evidence bags, others unrolling yellow crime scene tape. The small section of woods, once just another hunting spot, was now a controlled investigation site. One officer carefully took the watch and bone fragment from the hunter's hands, sealing it in a bag. Others photographed the tree roots, the ground, every angle of the area. Their movements were sharp and serious. The hunters stood off to the side, shaken. What had started as a normal morning now felt like something out of a nightmare. The forest was no longer just a place to hunt. It was a place holding answers and possibly more secrets. At the local station, investigators placed the watch on a clean table. Under bright lights, they studied every detail. Though aged, it was still intact enough to reveal something critical. A technician flipped the watch over, checking the back. Faintly engraved numbers came into view, the serial code. Investigators compared it against old records. The room grew tense. Every second felt heavy as they waited for confirmation. Finally, the match came back. The serial number was registered to the missing pilot. The news spread quickly. Officers who had been calm now exchanged uneasy looks. Some whispered, unable to believe it. After 13 long years, a piece of the missing man had been found. The realization hit hard. The search teams back in 1984 had combed this area. They had flown over it, walked through it, mapped it. And yet, the watch and remains had stayed hidden until now. The forest, which once gave nothing, had suddenly handed over proof. For the pilot's family, this discovery would soon break open years of silence. For investigators, it raised even bigger questions. If this small piece had been found, what else lay hidden in the woods? The discovery hit the town like an earthquake. Within hours of the hunter's call, the news spread through radio, TV, and word of mouth. Families who remembered the pilot stopped in their tracks. Neighbors who had searched 13 years ago gathered on porches, whispering. At the diner, forks froze in midair as someone read the headline aloud. How could they miss it? People asked again and again. The question echoed everywhere in homes, schools, and shops. Back then, hundreds of people had searched every inch of that forest. Planes had flown overhead for days. And yet, the wreckage, or at least a part of it, had remained unseen, buried in roots. The pilot's family received the news with mixed emotions. Relief that something had been found. But grief crashed back over them, heavier than before. For 13 years they had lived in limbo. Now, a single object, a watch strapped to a bone, tore the wound open again. The community was restless. Some whispered that maybe the search was never done right. Others asked if something had been covered up. Suspicion and doubt spread quickly. The mystery of the missing pilot had returned, louder than ever. Authorities wasted no time. The very next morning, specialists were called in. Forensic experts, aviation investigators, and new search teams arrived in the area. The forest, once ignored, was now the center of attention. Ground teams moved slowly, marking the soil, checking for disturbed earth, searching for metal fragments. Drones scanned the treetops. Helicopters circled overhead again, just like 13 years ago. But this time, the stakes felt different. Every officer and investigator carried the weight of the town's eyes. Radios buzzed with updates, while maps spread across hoods of vehicles tracked search grids. The sense of urgency was heavy. This was more than just a search. This was a second chance to finally answer what had haunted everyone for so long. The pilot's family visited the site, escorted by police. They stood quietly at the edge of the woods, staring into the trees. Their faces carried both hope and pain. Investigators promised answers, but beneath their calm words, even they knew this was not going to be simple. Something about this forest was wrong. As days passed, search teams pushed deeper into the thick woods. The forest resisted them at every step. Fallen trees blocked paths. Thick roots twisted over the ground. Mud sucked at boots as if guarding its secrets. Investigators found small signs, a twisted piece of metal, a shard of glass, but nothing clear, nothing big enough to explain where the rest of the plane had gone. The strangeness weighed on everyone. 13 years ago, searchers had stood in these same spots and seen nothing. Now, after a single watch was found, the forest began giving up scraps. It didn't feel natural. To many, it felt as though the woods themselves had swallowed the wreckage and only now were spitting it back out. Theories began forming quickly. Some said the plane had crashed deep underground, covered by shifting soil. Others insisted the search was sabotaged long ago. At night, flashlights flickered through the trees as officers refused to stop. The unease grew thicker. The missing pilot's story was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming something stranger, a secret hidden in plain sight, waiting to be fully revealed. The forest looked calm, almost peaceful, but the people walking into it knew better. Authorities, search teams, and investigators arrived in long lines of vehicles. They parked along the dirt road and began unloading equipment. Radios crackled. Camera crews adjusted their lenses. Every person there understood they might be standing on the edge of a discovery that had been buried for more than a decade. The hunters who first found the watch had already marked the spot. Bright tape fluttered from nearby branches. Investigators used it as their starting point. A perimeter was quickly set up, stretching in a wide circle. No one wanted to risk disturbing evidence. The forest seemed to press in on them. Tall trees blocked much of the sunlight, casting shifting shadows on the ground. Roots curled like veins across the soil, hiding whatever secrets lay beneath. Specialists unpacked ground-penetrating radar, shovels, and evidence kits. The mood was serious, almost heavy. Everyone knew what they were looking for, but no one dared say it out loud. The family of the missing pilot waited nearby, quiet and tense. For 13 years, they had lived with nothing. Now, the chance of answers was only a few feet away. The search began slowly, carefully. Every step had to be documented. Investigators combed the ground with sticks, metal detectors, and gloved hands. Hours passed before the first real find. A searcher crouched, brushing away leaves, and lifted a bent strip of metal. It was thin, jagged, and dulled by rust, but clearly manufactured. Investigators crowded around. Cameras flashed. The fragment was bagged and tagged. Not long after, another team called out. Buried in the mud was a cracked panel about the size of a window. Its once smooth surface was torn and bent. It looked like part of an airplane wing. The discoveries came slowly but steadily. A knob from a cockpit instrument, a strip of wiring tangled in roots. Each one told the same story: something mechanical had crashed here long ago. For the family, every new piece was a mix of pain and hope. Pain because it proved the worst had happened. Hope because it meant the long silence was finally breaking. Investigators whispered to each other. The scattered clues suggested something larger nearby. Everyone's eyes turned to the hills around them, waiting for the forest to reveal more. It happened near a muddy slope. A searcher slid on the soft ground and grabbed a root for balance. As he did, his boot struck something solid beneath the dirt. He crouched down, brushed aside the mud, and froze. The shape beneath wasn't rock. It was curved, metallic. "Over here," he shouted. Within seconds, investigators rushed over. Shovels and hands dug into the slope. Mud peeled away, roots snapped, and then the outline became clear, a massive piece of fuselage. The twisted metal stretched several feet long, its windows cracked, its paint barely visible under years of dirt. Tree roots wrapped tightly around it, weaving in and out of the frame like ropes. It looked less like wreckage and more like the forest had grown over it, swallowing it whole. The air shifted. No one spoke for several moments. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters scribbled notes. The weight of the discovery pressed on everyone. This was no longer fragments scattered in the dirt. This was the plane. After 13 years of mystery, the Earth had finally given up its secret. But the question lingered in every mind. How had this stayed hidden when hundreds of people had searched here before? The next step was proof. Investigators worked carefully around the main wreckage, uncovering key sections. A metal plate was found near the cockpit frame. Its serial number was intact. Investigators radioed the number back to headquarters. Minutes later, the confirmation came. It matched the missing pilot's plane. That single piece of evidence spread like wildfire. Radios buzzed, reporters rushed to broadcast updates, and officers stood grim-faced as the truth became official. More belongings surfaced. A leather flight bag, soaked and weathered but still holding maps. A headset, broken but recognizable. And near the cockpit, fragments of clothing that matched what the pilot had worn that day. The evidence was overwhelming. For 13 years, the mystery had consumed families, neighbors, and search teams. Now, standing in the forest, investigators knew the answer. The missing pilot had been here the whole time, but relief was mixed with disbelief. How had a plane crashed this close to search zones and gone unnoticed? Theories started immediately: bad weather, human error, or something more deliberate. The forest was silent again, but for everyone watching, one thought remained. This mystery was far from over. Investigators stood around the wreckage, staring at the twisted metal and broken frame. On paper, this location had already been searched. In fact, maps from the first days of the disappearance showed patrols had flown over this valley multiple times. Ground teams had combed nearby ridges. So how was it possible no one saw this? That question spread quickly among the teams. Some believed the thick forest had done the hiding. Over the years, trees had grown taller, branches had covered the slope, and roots had wrapped themselves around the fuselage. From the air, the wreckage blended perfectly into the earth. But others weren't convinced. They pointed out that pieces of metal were scattered in plain sight once searchers looked closely. How could so many people, for so many years, have missed it? Suspicion crept in. A few investigators quietly wondered if the search leaders had been careless, or worse, if they had purposely avoided this spot. Locals nearby, hearing the news, raised their eyebrows. Everyone felt tension in the air. The wreckage had been found, but instead of answers, it raised a darker question. Had the mystery been hidden on purpose? Within days, the site became a storm of theories. Experts debated openly on television and in newspapers. Some said nature itself had erased the crash. Forest growth, mudslides, and erosion could have buried the wreckage until only the watch remained visible. Others argued human oversight was the only explanation. Someone had missed something obvious. But more unsettling ideas began to spread. Rumors of sabotage surfaced. Could the plane have been forced down, then deliberately hidden? Others whispered about smuggling or secret cargo, claims that the pilot may have known something he shouldn't. Even the word government began to appear in conversations. The media poured fuel on the fire. Reporters highlighted every unexplained detail. The silence after the last transmission, the location so close to search routes, the fact that locals had walked this area before. Talk shows invited aviation experts who clashed in heated debates. In the community, whispers filled the streets. Families huddled in grocery stores, murmuring about cover-ups and conspiracies. For the missing pilot's family, the noise was overwhelming. They had waited 13 years for answers. Now, instead of clarity, the world seemed to be drowning in speculation. The mystery, somehow, had only deepened. The pilot's family was escorted to the site under heavy guard. Cameras stayed back, but the moment was caught by observers. They stood quietly at first, staring at the broken frame of the plane. Their faces showed disbelief. For so long, the wreckage had been a ghost, something imagined, never seen. Now it was real, bent and battered before them. Tears came quickly. His spouse held onto the frame of the fuselage, sobbing. Parents touched the metal softly, as though it might still carry a piece of him. For 13 years, they had lived with no answers. Now, pieces of truth were lying in the mud at their feet. The grief was crushing, but mixed with it was relief. Finally, the endless cycle of wondering, searching, and hopping had broken. He had been found. Still, closure was incomplete. The wreckage didn't explain why it had taken this long. It didn't explain the silence or the concealment. It didn't erase the pain of the lost years. The family clung to each other, broken but together. Their tears showed the weight of waiting, the pain of discovery, and the thin comfort of finally knowing. Authorities quickly locked down the site. Yellow tape stretched between trees. Uniformed officers stood guard at every entrance. The forest was no longer open ground. It had become a crime scene. Forensic teams arrived, unloading heavy cases of tools. They photographed every angle, measured debris fields, and carefully bagged fragments of metal. Nothing could be disturbed without documentation. The process was slow, deliberate, and tense. Journalists camped on the edges, broadcasting live updates. They spoke in hushed tones, describing the wreckage as investigators worked. The entire nation watched, waiting for the first official answers. Behind the scenes, specialists from aviation boards were called in. Crash investigators studied the site, mapping how the plane might have hit the ground. Others examined roots and soil to determine how long the wreckage had been hidden. Every detail mattered now. But the largest question hung heavy in the air. How had the wreckage stayed invisible for so long? 13 years of silence could not be explained by bad luck alone. Everyone, investigators, locals, even the pilot's family, wanted more than fragments. They wanted the full story. The act ended with suspense, the wreckage secured, and one chilling thought. The forest had hidden the truth, but had it hidden all of it? The crash site turned into a laboratory. Forensic teams stepped carefully through the mud, wearing gloves, masks, and protective suits. They marked each fragment with small flags and numbered tags. Photographers snapped pictures from every angle, documenting the twisted remains before anything was moved. The cockpit area drew the most attention. Investigators crouched inside, studying the bent control panels and shattered gauges. They measured angles of broken levers and noted how wires had been severed. To them, every detail mattered. A single scratch, dent, or mark could reveal whether this was an accident or something else. Engines were carefully examined. Mechanics removed panels, peered into chambers, and collected residue samples. Specialists noted corrosion from years of exposure, but they also checked for older damage that could show what happened on the day of the crash. Amid the chaos of cameras and questions from reporters outside the forest, the investigators worked calmly. Their movements were slow, practiced, and focused. They knew the family and the world had been waiting for 13 years. Now it was their job to bring answers. But as hours turned into days, the wreckage gave up very little. The silence of the plane seemed almost deliberate. Once the wreckage was documented, attention shifted to the skis and machinery. Meteorologists dug through old weather records from the day the pilot vanished. The data showed light winds in the morning, but sudden gusts and patches of turbulence in the region later that day. A surprise downdraft, they explained, could have forced the small plane downward. If the pilot had little time to react, he might have lost control. At the same time, engineers dismantled what was left of the engines and instruments. They searched for cracks, failed bearings, or burnt wiring that could explain a sudden malfunction. Some pieces were too corroded to tell, but others hinted at possible trouble. One mechanic thought the carburetor might have failed. Another suspected a blocked fuel line. The theories were all technical, all reasonable, but none were definitive. Reporters latched onto the uncertainty. Was it weather? Was it mechanical? Headlines spread, each pointing in different directions. For the family, the explanations felt thin. They wanted certainty, not maybes. But investigators admitted the truth. After so many years buried under soil, trees, and weather, the evidence was damaged beyond full clarity. It was possible this was a tragic accident, but nothing proved it. As the investigation deepened, strange details began to surface. The plane had come down in a valley not far from the original search routes. In fact, records showed that search planes had flown directly over this area many times in the days after the disappearance. Ground teams had also combed nearby trails. So why had no one seen it? Investigators noted the terrain was steep and heavily wooded. In 1984, the canopy may have been even thicker, making it harder to spot wreckage from the air. Over the years, trees and brush grew even taller, swallowing the remains until it blended perfectly into the hillside. But that explanation didn't satisfy everyone. Some searchers from the original mission remembered flying low over that very valley. They swore nothing was there. A few claimed they had been told to avoid certain areas for reasons never explained. These inconsistencies fueled debate. Was it human error? Did search leaders overlook obvious signs? Or had something been deliberately hidden? The oddities added layers to the mystery. The wreckage had been found, but the circumstances of how it stayed invisible for so long made investigators uneasy. It no longer felt like just an accident. With the wreckage finally revealed, rumors exploded. Some townspeople whispered about sabotage. They believed someone had tampered with the plane before takeoff, maybe loosening parts or cutting wires. The idea spread fast, feeding on the mystery of why the crash had remained hidden. Others pushed darker suspicions. They claimed the government had been involved. Maybe the pilot had seen or carried something he wasn't supposed to. Perhaps officials had known where the plane was all along but kept it secret. Whispers of cover-ups filled the air. Then came the smuggling theories. Old stories resurfaced about hidden flight paths used for moving illegal goods through remote areas. Was the pilot caught in something larger than himself? Was he forced off course, his plane deliberately grounded in the valley? Locals added their own doubts. Some remembered unusual planes flying overhead around the time he vanished. Others recalled roadblocks near the forest. Every memory, even the faintest, became part of the puzzle. Theories piled on top of each other, until the truth seemed buried beneath speculation. In the end, no one agreed. But one thing was clear. The mystery wasn't just about a missing pilot anymore. It was about secrets people believed had been kept for 13 long years. The town was divided. At coffee shops and gas stations, conversations grew tense. Some locals demanded clear answers. They accused authorities of failing in the original search. Others blamed the family for holding onto hope and dragging the town into endless speculation. The pilot's family felt the weight of every word. His spouse, already scarred from years of waiting, now faced whispers that maybe the disappearance hadn't been an accident at all. That possibility cut deeper than silence ever had. His parents, still holding onto the image of their son as a careful, skilled pilot, were forced to hear people suggest foul play or hidden secrets. Emotions boiled. Some townspeople stood firmly with the family, insisting they deserved the truth after so many years. Others grew frustrated, wishing the case would simply be closed and the questions put to rest. For the family, the renewed theories were unbearable. They had prayed for closure, but now closure seemed even further away. Every rumor only created new pain. The crash site had been found, but the truth remained hidden. The town's once shared grief had turned into suspicion, confusion, and mistrust. The mystery was no longer just about loss. It was tearing the community apart. Investigators tried to cut through the noise. They gathered maps, flight charts, and weather data from the day the pilot vanished. They pulled in witness statements from people who had seen or heard the plane on its last journey. Step by step, they reconstructed the final flight. The plane had left the hangar right on schedule. Witnesses near the town confirmed it flew smoothly, gaining altitude in clear skies. Radar records showed the craft moving along its planned route. Everything looked routine until it reached the valley where the wreckage was eventually found. There, things grew murky. Weather reports suggested strong turbulence at that exact time. One scenario showed the plane hitting a sudden downdraft, dropping faster than the pilot could recover. Another possibility showed mechanical failure, the engine sputtering before the descent. Investigators even used a flight simulator to replay the conditions. On screen, the plane dipped, banked sharply, and lost altitude. The audience could almost see the pilot's last desperate moves, pulling the controls, scanning the gauges, trying to keep the craft level. Then silence. The reconstructed flight gave glimpses of those final moments, but it still couldn't explain everything. The mystery lingered, just beyond reach. The investigation reached a boiling point. One group of experts insisted the crash was caused by mechanical failure. They pointed to wear on engine parts and damage to the control system. According to them, the pilot had been helpless once the machinery gave out. Another group disagreed. They argued the real cause was bad weather. Meteorologists explained that sudden turbulence or strong winds could easily push a small plane off course. In their view, the stormy conditions that day had sealed the pilot's fate. Others leaned toward human error. They believed the pilot might have become disoriented or misjudged his altitude in the valley. To them, it was tragic but simple, a mistake in the air that turned fatal. But not everyone accepted those explanations. A smaller group whispered about intentional diversion. They suggested the pilot had been forced down, either by someone on board or by threats from the outside. This theory fueled whispers of sabotage, smuggling, or even government secrets. Each opinion was delivered with confidence, yet none had enough proof to stand above the rest. Every press conference only added more confusion. Instead of clarity, the community was left with a maze of conflicting voices, each one claiming to hold the truth. Months passed. Investigators combed through wreckage reports, re-examined maps, and reviewed every theory. Yet no single answer came out. Mechanical failure, maybe. Bad weather, possible. Human error, likely. But each explanation had holes. Nothing fully accounted for why the plane had vanished for 13 years or why search teams missed it. The family's frustration grew. They had waited so long for closure, but now the answers felt just as far away. Every theory only left more questions. Neighbors debated in hushed tones. Local reporters filled newspapers with speculation. The community could feel the tension in the air, heavy and unresolved. Authorities finally announced the official cause, inconclusive. The wreckage did not give a final answer. The mystery remained unsolved. For the family, that word, inconclusive, was unbearable. For the town, it only deepened suspicion. For the audience, it created a chilling sense of unfinished business. The case had gone from a missing plane to a hidden wreckage to years of theories. And yet, no one could say with certainty what truly happened. The act closed not with answers, but with silence. The suspense now pointed toward the final act, where the family's grief, the community's questions, and the pilot's legacy would finally collide. Months of analysis finally came to an end. Authorities released their official report on the crash. The conclusion was simple but heavy. The pilot had died on impact the day his plane went missing. Investigators explained that the aircraft had shown signs of possible mechanical trouble. Small issues with the control system may have combined with the difficult terrain below. The valley where the wreckage was found was steep and unforgiving. Once the plane descended, there was little chance of survival. The dense forest explained why search teams had missed it for so long. Over the years, trees, mud, and roots had hidden almost every trace. What looked like empty woods from above had been covering the truth all along. Officials stressed there was no evidence of foul play, no signs of sabotage, no crime, no cover-up. The crash was declared a tragic accident. But while the case was officially closed, tension lingered. Many in the community felt unsettled. How could so many searches have passed over the exact spot? Why did it take 13 years and a hunter's lucky discovery for the truth to surface? The answers gave closure, but they didn't erase the unease. When the family received the news, emotions collided. There was relief. After 13 long years, they finally knew what had happened. No more wondering if he was alive somewhere. No more late nights waiting for a call that would never come. But there was also grief. The finality of death hit hard. For so long, hope had kept them moving. Now, with confirmation that hope vanished, the truth left behind only loss. They visited the crash site with investigators. Standing in the forest, they looked at twisted pieces of metal, broken glass, and soil that had buried their father, husband, and son for over a decade. The watch, the bones, the fuselage, all of it told a story they never wanted to hear. One family member held the pilot's belongings in their hands: a cracked pair of glasses, a rusted belt buckle. Small things that once seemed meaningless now carried unbearable weight. Tears fell, hugs lingered, and silence spoke louder than words. Processing 13 years of waiting in a single moment was almost impossible. But finally, the family had a truth they could hold on to, even if it shattered their hearts. The next step was bringing him home. Authorities arranged for the pilot's remains to be returned to his family. After years of being missing, his story could finally end with dignity. A small funeral was planned. The town gathered quietly, lining the streets as the family walked with the casket. Faces showed a mix of sadness and respect. For 13 years, everyone had carried this mystery. Now, they came together to say goodbye. The ceremony was simple but deeply emotional. Flowers surrounded the casket. Photographs of the pilot stood nearby, smiling in better days. Friends shared stories of his kindness, his love for flying, and his devotion to his family. For the family, the moment was overwhelming. They had spent years in limbo, not knowing, not able to grieve. Now, as they lowered him into the ground, they finally had a place to visit, a marker to touch, and a way to honor him. The community stood in silence, heads bowed. The weight of 13 years was heavy in the air. It wasn't the ending anyone had wanted, but it was an ending at last. The pilot was finally home. As the funeral ended, memories came rushing back. For the family, the last 13 years replayed in painful flashes. They remembered the empty hangar, where his plane should have returned but never did. They remembered nights sitting by the phone, hopping for a call. They remembered spreading maps across the kitchen table, searching for a clue that was never there. The house had remained frozen in time. His jacket still hung by the door. His coffee cup still sat on the counter, untouched. Every small detail was a reminder of the life that had been interrupted. Living with uncertainty had left scars that no report could erase. Every birthday, every holiday, every year that passed without answers had deepened the pain. The hardest part wasn't just losing him. It was not knowing what had happened. Now the truth was clear, but the years of waiting couldn't be undone. The story reminded everyone watching that missing persons cases are more than headlines. They leave families trapped in limbo, forced to balance hope with despair. For this family, the discovery ended the mystery, but it also highlighted just how much of life had been lost to the silence of unanswered questions. Among all the items found, one stood out above the rest: the watch. It had been discovered tangled in the roots of a tree, nearly hidden by dirt and leaves. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than junk. But when the hunter brushed it clean, the truth emerged. The watch belonged to the missing pilot. Its serial number matched records. After 13 years, this small object had finally broken the silence. Investigators explained that the watch likely came loose during the crash and became buried over time. As the forest shifted, tree roots slowly pushed it back toward the surface, until it was just visible enough to catch a hunter's eye. Without that watch, the wreckage might have remained hidden for years more, maybe forever. To the family, the watch was more than metal and glass. It became a symbol, a silent witness to the pilot's final moments, a clue that spoke when nothing else could. Displayed carefully by investigators, the watch told the story of how even the smallest detail can change everything. In the end, it was this simple object that reopened the case, leading to truth at last. The news spread quickly, reaching every corner of the town. Neighbors visited the burial site, leaving flowers, notes, and prayers. Some stood quietly, heads bowed. Others shared stories of how the pilot had touched their lives before his disappearance. Local newspapers and television covered the burial, showing images of the community gathered in mourning. People who had been children when the plane went missing were now adults, standing shoulder to shoulder with older residents who still remembered the day he vanished. Mixed emotions filled the air. There was relief. Finally, the long mystery had an answer. There was sadness, the reality of his death was undeniable, and there was awe that the forest had managed to conceal such a large wreck for so long, hiding it in plain sight while everyone searched elsewhere. For many, the discovery sparked reflection on their own lives, how fragile time is, how quickly things can change. The pilot's story became more than just a tragedy. It became a reminder of the strength of family, the persistence of hope, and the strange, powerful way nature can guard its secrets. In the end, the town mourned together and remembered. As the years of searching finally ended, the story of the missing pilot took its final shape. He had been more than just a man in a plane. He was a father, a husband, a neighbor, and a friend. His absence left a hole in the community that could never be fully filled. For 13 years, his family carried the weight of that silence. They lived through sleepless nights, endless questions, and painful anniversaries. But their perseverance became part of his legacy. They refused to give up when others moved on. They kept his name alive when the world forgot. That persistence is what made the eventual discovery matter so deeply. The nightmare had begun with a short, ordinary flight, one that should have lasted less than an hour. But instead, it stretched into a 13-year mystery filled with false hopes and heartbreaking dead ends. And in the end, the answer didn't come from high-tech searches or government resources. It came from something small, a watch, buried in tree roots, waiting to be seen. The pilot's story now carried a clear lesson. Sometimes closure arrives not through grand discoveries, but through persistence, patience, and the smallest of clues. The camera lingers on the forest. Trees sway quietly, hiding the scars of the wreckage that had once been invisible. Time had covered the truth, holding it in silence until one clue forced it into the light. At the crash site, twisted metal remains among roots and soil, almost part of the earth itself. Investigators step carefully, documenting what's left. The forest feels both ordinary and haunting, a reminder of how it concealed answers for over a decade. Then the focus shifts to the watch. Cleaned, preserved, and placed safely behind glass, it now tells a story greater than the time it once measured. It became the key that unlocked years of confusion and despair. The audience is left with awe and melancholy. Life is fragile. One moment can change everything. Mysteries don't always end quickly, and sometimes they don't end at all. But in this case, persistence and hope push the truth to the surface. The story closes not just on the loss of a pilot, but on the reminder that answers, even buried deep in silence, can be found. And when they are, they reshape the way we remember, mourn, and move forward.